Okay, well, good morning now. I think we might start because we have speakers who are very tight to time. So my name is Martina Hennessy. I'm the chair of the Trinity International Development Initiative, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here to our celebration for Africa Day. I especially would like to welcome Their Excellencies, the ambassadors of Lesotho, Kenya, who is on her way from Limerick, Morocco, Ethiopia and South Africa, and the representatives of Nigeria and Egypt, along with our own Minister Joe Costello and our distinguished speakers. So we're here today in celebration of a unity across the continent of Africa, and most importantly this year, the 50th anniversary of African Union. It's a very important opportunity for us to reflect on the progress and transformation that has taken place across Africa, as well as some of the issues that continue to hinder development, such as security, hunger and inequality. Now, we've themed the day Africa Rising, not in recognition of the debates that are ongoing in The Economist, in which many of you will be familiar with, one side of which suggests that Africa is experiencing unparalleled high growth rates and increased foreign investment, versus the other side of that argument, which is that if Africa is rising, it is rising as a wealth generator for the multinationals and not for Africans themselves. We believe that the two sides of that narrative are overly simplistic, and you will all have your own view on that. So instead, we're here today to bring you what we believe are real-life, inspirational narratives from Africa across the three pillars of health, economics and climate resilience. These are stories of real progress by real people that demonstrate real leadership and high impact on communities. And they attest really to the human capital and the potential of Africa, and the growing realisation that an Africa that is nurtured and encouraged properly can and will have everything that it needs to educate its people, generate its research, grow its economies, solve its own problems and create new knowledge for the benefit of all of us. So the day doesn't belong to TIDI, although we're hosting it. The day belongs to the African ambassadors and to our speakers. So without any further delay, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Professor Adrian Hill from the Jenner Institute in Oxford. Adrian has very generously and graciously agreed at very short notice to take the place of our announced speaker, Professor Nana Poku, who finds himself delayed on a UN mission to Mali. Now, Professor Adrian Hill is the Professor of Human Genetics at Oxford and Director of the Jenner Institute. He actually began his medical career as a student here in Trinity College in Dublin, but then changed over to Oxford, something we've never quite forgiven him for. And I would have to say, I think he's a tiny little bit guilty about it, and we exploit that to good effect by making sure he comes back very often to speak for us. He has spent 25 years working to increase our understanding of genetic susceptibility to malaria, and he's a leading expert in the development of a malaria vaccine, and also in genome-wide association studies of bacterial diseases such as pneumococcal disease and tuberculosis. Every day, this man and his team of researchers work to close the gap between the preclinical vaccine studies and its translation into large-scale clinical efficacy studies. And I feel certain that this will be the future. Closing this gap will add huge value to health in Africa. Over 50 clinical trials have been undertaken by Jenner investigators in recent years in developing new vaccines against malaria, HIV, tuberculosis, meningitis and influenza. Professor Hill has published over 350 research papers and is a fellow of the UK Academy of Medical Sciences. Moreover, and more importantly, he is a very constant and a tireless supporter of programmes that seek to develop the intellectual capital of young African researchers and organisations such as TIDI and the School of Medicine here at Trinity College. Today, he will take us through an inspiring story, really, of progress towards a malaria vaccine. Professor Adrian Hill.
Professor Hennessy, Minister, Your Excellencies, academic colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to come back to Trinity, particularly to TIDI, particularly to a symposium focusing on what is a huge global issue, on a day of celebration of progress in Africa. Somebody asked me just now, you go to Africa a lot, what's the mood like there? And the honest answer is the mood is a heck of a lot better than it is in most of Western Europe at the moment. Things are growing, things are changing, things are improving. They They say this is going to be the century of Africa. I think that's probably right. So one of the things I really like about TIDI is its breadth, tackling development from a whole variety of angles, as you can do in a great university like Trinity. But my own interests, as you've heard, are more narrow. They're on health, they're on developing capacity in Africa for health research. So I'm just going to focus on one small but important success story in vaccines and vaccine development, and tell you about something that's been happening without as much attention as it should have received over the last 5 or 6 years in the vaccine area in Africa. I work in this green building at the University of Oxford, and as you heard, we try to make malaria vaccines, HIV vaccines, TB vaccines, a very difficult field scientifically, but one where there is substantial progress. Try and get this to click forward. Why don't I come over here? Can you hear me from here? Yes. You sure? Okay. So Africa's century, well, it wasn't a great starting point. This slide was made 6 or 7 years ago and shows some of these stark inequities on the planet. Not quite as bad today as they were 5 or 6 years ago. Looking at malaria deaths, heavily concentrated in Africa. Tuberculosis cases, same story, but a lot more cases in Asia. The number of doctors per head of population, absolutely the converse. And scientific research, which I'll be talking about, again, starkly underrepresented in Africa. So, not a great starting point. And of course, what we really care about is morbidity and mortality in the health sector. And again, the great burden of these diseases, HIV, TB, malaria, pneumococcus, is in the African continent, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. But note that many of these diseases, those numbers, I've been showing this slide for about 10 years now, have gone down dramatically. Measles used to be millions of deaths. It's now about 100,000 and still falling rapidly. And that's due to vaccination. So we desperately need vaccines, I would argue, for HIV, for malaria, better TB vaccine, to control this unacceptable disease burden. And vaccines are the most cost-effective medical intervention that has ever been deployed. 2 diseases have been eradicated. I'll come back to those. Millions of lives are saved every year. A major contributor to global life expectancy increasing as dramatically as it has worldwide. And very importantly, a major facilitator of economic growth, not just through human vaccines, but through vaccines for livestock and enhancing farming. Therefore, a major contributor to global food security and poverty alleviation. And what people don't so often realize is this is a huge European success story. Most vaccines are made in Europe. Most of the returns are in Europe. The investment, the employment, and the intellectual property is in Europe. But there are missing vaccines, as you can see on this slide. HIV, malaria, a good TB vaccine, lots for dengue and others that we would like to have. And what's most concerned me over the last 20 years is malaria. This is a child I looked after shortly before she sadly died in the Gambia 20 years ago, dying from cerebral malaria. And this is still a huge cause of mortality and morbidity. We're doing better. The number used to be about 1 million deaths a year. It's now 750,000 or thereabouts, mostly young children, mostly in Africa. And on top of that unacceptable mortality, there are about 250 million clinical cases every year. And if you've been one of those clinical cases, you know that's no small deal. We're trying. We're spending more money on malaria control than ever before, close to 2 billion last year. We're spraying insecticides, using better drugs, spreading the use of impregnated bed nets, and that's helping. But it's not the final answer, and most of these have a finite period of utility, so we need a vaccine. And we also appreciate that the economic cost of malaria to Africa in terms of loss of economic growth, quite separate from the unacceptable disease burden, is of the order of billions, perhaps $12 billion per year, it's been estimated. So if we could do something about that, it would be really, really useful. What we try and do at our small institute in England is take concepts coming out of basic research for how you could make a vaccine against AIDS or malaria or TB, and try and go across what we call the valley of death, because most ideas don't make it through, to a product that would eventually control this unacceptable disease burden. And we're not alone, obviously, in doing this. There's a huge amount of interest in trying to tackle the problem. What I want to tell you about today is one organization, which is not well known, which has made a really big difference in this field. It's got a not so catchy name, the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, or EDCTP, as we call it. EDCTP is based in The Hague in the Netherlands. It currently supports nearly 200 research projects, including 57 clinical trials that have enrolled over 100,000 subjects in Africa. So no small organization. It's something the European Commission is rightly proud of. Maura Geoghegan-Quinn, the Commissioner for Research, Innovation and Science, commented just last November, this is a brilliant success story for EU-Africa research cooperation that's become a key player in the global health arena. It's really within 6 or 7 years, within a decade. Ongoing programs involve 42 institutions in Europe, but 156 in Africa, doing world-class scientific research and development. Most of the funding has gone to African institutions. 70% of the projects are led by African researchers, including the malaria vaccine one that I'm involved with, led by Babatunde Igaro and Imekude, a Nigerian. And the really good news is that this is expanding from a 200 million euro enterprise to a 1 billion euro expenditure from next year. It's been such a success. What does it do? Well, for example, just in the vaccine space, and it's not just vaccines, it's vaccines, drugs, and diagnostics for major diseases, mainly in Africa, testing the most advanced new TB vaccine in clinical development in Senegal and South Africa. We've been involved in malaria vaccines, I'll say a little bit about that, and an HIV AIDS vaccine, the next to enter efficacy testing, the first actually for efficacy testing in Africa, is being supported by EDCTP in Kenya. So just to give you a flavour of what's changed in 10 years in Africa, if I had to do a vaccine trial 10 years ago, and we had a really promising malaria vaccine candidate, we would have to send people from Europe to go and set up that trial in Africa to make sure it was done correctly. That is absolutely no longer the case. Here's one vaccine, actually from GSK, called RTSS. It's a candidate malaria vaccine, looking reasonably promising. They've just done a trial in nearly 15,000 children in Africa at over 10 clinical trial centres, you can see where they are on the map here, to international quality, good clinical practice standard with a fantastic data set. That could not have happened 10 years ago. There wasn't the capacity to do regulatory standard trials in Africa. Their vaccine works in an interesting way. After the mosquito bites and gives you malaria parasites, the vaccine produces antibodies from this particle that mop up the parasites before they go into the liver. Its efficacy, sadly, is only around about 30%, but that's 30% more than anything else that we had until a few years ago. We've now developed in Oxford a second part of what we see as a combination vaccine that will work on the liver stage of malaria and target the parasite in here, inside cells, as well as mopping them up before they get into the liver. That's going well. We have new technology based on viruses that we use as vaccines in phase 2 clinical trials. There are only 3 phases. Phase 2 is the one before the final licensure phase in phase 3. We've done trials with this in adults in West Africa initially, more recently in the target population of young infants. This is a fantastic clinic in the Gambia, part of that EDCTP project. And that vaccine is now in a large-scale efficacy trial in infants with this chap, Sodiman Sarima, who's head of the CNFP group in Burkina Faso at a fantastic trial site down in Banfora in the south of the country. This is a well-qualified team, as this slide shows you. They've all been internationally trained and gone back to Burkina to set up what is a fantastic clinical trials facility, which is well-funded and thriving, and people like myself are competing to get in there and collaborate with excellent facilities and equipment. And this is the whole range of competencies for testing a vaccine, from lab skills, to clinic work, to field work, and the data analysis. These are full partners in European-African collaborations. A couple of other very brief examples. This is the world's leading TB vaccine field site. It's the only really good one. It's in South Africa, in Worcester, about 100 miles from Cape Town. Had a paper in The Lancet just a couple of months ago, the first efficacy trial in 50 years of a TB vaccine, the first efficacy trial ever of a subunit vaccine, excellent safety, not good enough efficacy, sadly, but promising second generation candidates coming along. And the biggest challenge of all, an HIV vaccine. The central problem is that the virus, the HIV virus, is dramatically variable between different strains. We've never vaccinated against anything that looks like that. Can we cope with that genetic diversity? Some people would say no. I think probably we can. But it needs innovative new approaches, the like of which we've never used before, taking the genome of HIV, cutting it into little strips of the conserved segments, stitching those together, making a novel insert of the segments that are conserved functionally between different virus strains, putting that into clinical trials. That's been done. This is Thomas Hankey's work. And that's gone on to field trials in Kenya. So it feels slow, vaccine development, but there is dramatic progress. New ideas that have never been tried before being tested in collaboration with major leading figures at African sites. So it is a good news story. It is something we should be proud of. It's something we should do more of. It's an illustration of how partnerships can work, I think, in other sectors as well. But we have to invest in capacity development. Otherwise, it can't happen. And remember, not everything is sorted, even in this field of vaccine development. As I said, clinical trial capacity has risen dramatically in a decade, out of all recognition. But preclinical research and development has not had significant investment. I train lots of African graduate students in the Institute in Oxford. They have nowhere to go in Africa where they can design vaccines and bring them along. There's no pipeline of locally made vaccines, and there are local diseases that people don't know about, like Rift Valley fever we need a vaccine for in East Africa. That's got to come from local investment in R&D. We need a pipeline of vaccines made in Africa for Africa. That's the next phase, and people are beginning to think about that. But it's absolutely crucial that we have the scientific infrastructure in Africa to support the remarkable things that are happening at the moment. So, investment in basic science and biomanufacturing. So when the next flu pandemic comes along, vaccines can be manufactured in countries in Africa, not imported from abroad, and we need to turn our attention to that. Can it be done, or is that just a pipe dream? I think it can be, and in fact it has been. Only 2 diseases have been eradicated from the planet. One you know about, smallpox. We called our institute after the guy who invented that, Edward Jenner, quite a long time ago. The other one that was eradicated only 2 years ago was not a human disease, it was a livestock disease, a very important disease for farming in Africa, and it's gone. It was rinderpest. But the punchline is the vaccine for rinderpest was designed and made in East Africa, in Maguga, in Kenya. So this can be done. It has been done, and we should do more of it. So to leave you on an upbeat note, vaccines are coming. There will be a malaria vaccine. Might even be one licensed in 2 years, but it's not terribly effective. 2020 is a more realistic date for TB, 2025, and probably around about 2030 for HIV. So this takes time, but it's important and it has to be done. And I think it's a nice example of the partnerships that we need to build capacity in the research sector. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your attention.
I know that Adrian has to get a flight, but I still think perhaps he would be able to take one question. Anybody? I think it's an inspiring story. I've no doubt we'll be seeing your name in lights, and we'll be going back to the days when we had Adrian here, you know, to speak for us. So I think it's an amazing story and very positive. And how do you feel that the development of a vaccine would fit in with the development of a universal health system across Africa?
So again, I haven't talked about this, but delivering vaccines is another success story. So there's been huge investment in the infrastructure for delivering vaccines to babies in Africa. In countries in West Africa, the coverage rate of vaccination is higher than in Britain and Ireland, because there's a fantastic structure for delivering vaccines at certain age groups, so at birth, at 2, 3 and 4 months of age. And of course that's integrated into wider health systems and has to stay so, but it does pose a constraint on people like me trying to devise a vaccine that'll work well. You have to be able to give it at those time points. No good having a vaccine that works in 2-year-olds. We don't vaccinate 2-year-olds in general. So you've got to be able to adapt to the infrastructure that is there. But of course, there's no point vaccinating babies early if you haven't got the infrastructure to maintain the health systems in those countries. So all of this has to be integrated, but we do as well need new cost-effective tools to deploy.
Thank you. So now, we were very grateful to Adrian for taking the time to come over to us at such short notice. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Minister Joe Costello. It's always a pleasure to have your input. And again, we're very conscious that you're taking time out of an extremely busy schedule to come here today. So Minister Costello has always been a fantastic and tireless supporter, really, of a great number of organisations: TIDI, SUAS, DSAI, TROCRA, Concern, Self-Help Africa, and a great many other academic and civil society groups. We really, I think, between us have no idea how you manage to fit in so many events into a single day, but we suspect that you have a big bag of flu powder somewhere up in the Dáil, and you're using that to transfigure into various places. I firmly believe that really the reason why you do all that is because you have such a genuine personal commitment to international development, and that always comes through when you come to speak with us. During your tenure as Minister, along with your colleagues in Irish Aid, I think you can be very proud of the fact that you have kept the aid budget secure and also on tide, I think, which is a huge achievement. You've overseen the review of the White Paper and, of course, the release of the policy document, One World, One Future on International Development. And the policy places a much stronger focus on our engagement in promoting stability and development in countries that are experiencing increased fragility. So it is a very important move forward. And moreover, I think you have delivered another very important aim and objective, and that is a seat for Ireland on the UN Council for Human Rights, a source, I believe, of great satisfaction to yourself and certainly to us. And it ensures that Ireland's commitment to human rights remains centre stage. So we are absolutely delighted that you could take the time to provide continued leadership to us for events such as this. Minister Costello.
Thank you very much, Margaret, with that very flattering introduction. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me, indeed, and an honour to be here today to be able to address you on this Trinity International Initiative, Development Initiative, which I did last year for the first time, and hope to have the pleasure of doing it in the future as well. And it's also a pleasure to be doing it on what you might call, what really is the eve of Africa Day. It begins the weekend, which Africa Day is a bit like St. Patrick's Day now. It's getting longer and longer, and instead of being a day, it's a weekend, and then it's a week. I was over in Africa for St. Patrick's Day this year, and I had to go to 5 different St. Patrick's Day and close to 5 different days in different countries in Africa. So that's the way it's becoming. So Africa Day is likewise, it's expanding exponentially. And as you mentioned, the ambassador to Kenya is on her way from Limerick, where there was a function, Africa Day function, and we will ourselves here in Irish Aid be completing our Africa Days. Our main Africa Day event will be in Farmley on Sunday, which is an all-day family event, which I hope you can attend. And it's, of course, particularly important this year because it's the 50th anniversary of the African Union, so it's all the more an important occasion to celebrate this day. I was struck very much, well, first of all, I'm struck by the title, which I think is a fantastic title, Africa Rising. and the emphasis on health and economics and resilience. It's not, as Margaret mentioned, it's not just Africa rising in terms of economic terms, it is in the broad development in society as well as in economic terms. And again, I was struck by what Professor Hill had to say there in relation to the vaccines, which is so important that you can have mass inoculation, so therefore you can deal with these communicable diseases which have caused so many fatalities to vulnerable populations right across Africa and are doing so today at the present time. And it was great to see that he actually perceives, targets, dates to have these vaccines in place. I was recently at a pledging conference in Abu Dhabi where Bill Gates brought countries from all over the world to pledge funding for the elimination of polio. There have been only two diseases in the world that have been wiped out, and Bill Gates is anxious, as is quite a lot of other organisations under the United Nations and the European Union, and indeed there's major work being done by various countries and various NGOs. But to set a target for the elimination of polio from the world by 2018, a 5-year target, and this will be done by mass vaccination, inoculation in the areas where it is still in existence. And it's only in existence in 3 countries in the world, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and in Nigeria. So it was a very successful conference. 4 billion was put together for that purpose. But wouldn't it be great if these other communicable diseases like malaria, like TB, and like AIDS, HIV, could actually be dealt with in this fashion? So the work that has been done by people like Professor Hill is fantastic indeed. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about vaccines, though I might mention before I finish on that point is that perhaps Professor Hill didn't realise that the 1 billion that he thinks he has in his pocket for the research work from 2014 to 2020 is not really available, that this depends on the Irish Presidency getting a deal on the multi-annual financial budget, which goes from 2014 to 2020. So far we haven't got a deal on it, but we would hope to have it determined and decided by the end of our presidency, and that then will allow the money to be paid up. Otherwise, if we don't get a deal on it, it means that the budgets will come on an annual basis, and the long-term planning that is within that multi-annual budget of 7 years will not be possible to be done. So it is a very serious matter indeed. So we're pushing that and to get it concluded by the end of June. The theme of today's conference is of particular interest to me personally, as the post-2015 agenda has been a major feature of our work as European Union Presidency during the first half of this year. And of course, we're coming to conclusions now. Actually, next week, in the 28th of May, we will be elaborating on our presidency conclusions. We're very conscious that the paradigm for development will change after 2015, and that this will have implications both for those who provide development assistance and for those who have traditionally received it. The concerted international effort to implement the Millennium Development Goals has seen substantial progress in many areas. Reductions in absolute poverty, in hunger, and in infant and maternal mortality. This progress should neither be understated nor taken for granted, but the reality is that much remains to be done, and that in some areas relatively little progress has been made. For example, I was at an international conference yesterday in Brussels where we were discussing the educational progress of the MDGs, and it was noteworthy that there had been enormous success in terms of school attendance at primary level. We had Cambodia saying 97%, Senegal 96%, I think around the 90s in Tanzania and so on. But that roughly 2/3 of the population that were attending school had not even reached basic grade 4 level, which is literacy and numeracy. So in fact, the MDGs have been enormously successful in providing access to schools, and it's equal across the board. Gender equality is there at primary level, almost exactly 50-50, but the learning process has been a complete failure. And so there's been enormous successes, and there have been some signal failures. As the European Union presidency, Ireland's had an active and efficient, I think, and effective role in the area of international development following detailed preparations last year. We worked in close cooperation with our partners, in particular the European Union High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Catherine Ashton, and her European External Action Service to achieve concrete outcomes on development issues. So, some 12 months ago, we identified 3 key areas in the European Union's development and humanitarian agenda which Ireland would seek to progress during our presidency. And those 3 areas were, firstly, ensuring that the European Union engages strongly and coherently in the development of the post-2015 agenda. Secondly, building the linkages between the thematic issues of hunger, nutrition and climate change in policy and in practice. And thirdly, forging stronger links between emergency humanitarian relief and long-term development, in other words, resilience. As we move towards the development segment of the Foreign Affairs Council at the end of May, we can say with justification that we have made substantial progress across all 3 priority areas and have met or are on line to meet the goals set out at the outset of the presidency. The conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Council next week will be the basis for the European Union position at the United Nations high-level event on the MDGs in New York in September, and will inform the European Union position in all negotiations on the post-2015 development framework. The main issue in the international development agenda is what will replace the Millennium Development Goals, which are due to expire in 2015. The global community has made major progress in fighting poverty since the MDGs were agreed in the year 2000. They have helped identify where progress in development has been made and have galvanised efforts to make additional efforts in areas where progress has been slower than expected. African countries have made significant strides over the past 13 years, but while there has been considerable progress, there are still challenges, particularly with regard to maternal mortality, HIV and AIDS, and malaria, as we have just heard. Access to clean drinking water and sanitation is still an issue, and of course links up with these communicable diseases as well, particularly in rural areas, and despite real advances, sub-Saharan Africa still has significant rates of poverty and food security, with almost 1 billion people suffering from hunger and undernutrition. In addition, the world is a different place, and we now face a new set of developing challenges, including climate change and environmental degradation, which threatens the livelihoods of many in Africa. Climate change is affecting all countries, but least developed countries and other vulnerable developing countries are expected to be hit earliest and hardest. Africa will be particularly affected in terms of food security, sustainable water supply, and extreme weather phenomena such as floods, droughts, and threats of desertification. And already this is a major problem. Economies and livelihoods of an increasing number of communities, countries, and sub-regions in Africa continue to decline due to desert encroachment, partly emanating from climate change and locally generated land degradation processes. When establishing a new global development framework, we must ensure that we continue the progress made through the MDGs, but at the same time we must comprehensively address these and other new and pressing global challenges. This is reflected in the intensity and range of discussions taking place across the world on what will replace the current MDGs. These discussions are taking place at the European Union, at high-level panel appointed by the United Nations Secretary-General, at the United Nations Open Working Forum on Sustainable Development Goals, and at the 11 thematic and over 50 country dialogues, almost half of which will be in Africa, being organised by the United Nations across the world. And the one that I was at yesterday was another one of those consultative processes. It is of the utmost importance that African voices, government, civil society and private sector are all heard. Africa has a lot to bring to the table in this discussion. It has the evidence, success stories and innovations to accelerate progress to 2015. Ideas about how the MDG framework could be improved to better capture the successes achieved and to continue making progress on the challenges that many African countries face and where they want to see focus in the new agenda. As the discussions progress, Ireland is engaging and listening. Given our well-established international reputation in development assistance, I am happy to say that there is an Irish thread throughout the post-2015 process. In addition to our EU presidency role, we are a member of the United Nations Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, and our ambassador to the United Nations in New York, Anne Anderson, will be co-facilitating the United Nations special event in September, along with our South African counterpart. Our missions in Africa will be participating in the country-level dialogues, and we will be listening to what African voices have to say and learning from their experiences as we develop our own position on the new development framework. As part of our engagement on the new development framework, post-2015, my department organised an international conference in partnership with the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Change, the World Food Programme in Dublin last month, which focused on the interlinked themes of hunger, nutrition and the impact of climate change. The conference brought together policymakers and over 100 representatives from grassroots communities in Asia, in Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean. It was a unique opportunity to bring about these challenges, to think about these challenges differently by listening to and learning from local views, practices and coping mechanisms. And any of you who were there would have seen that what the conference was about was very much grassroots up, and that it was based on learning circles where everybody had an opportunity to have their voice heard. Representatives of farmers, pastoralists, herders and local civil society constituted 1/3 of the participants at the conference. They brought their own experience of coping with these challenges, and we had very rich and very productive discussions. The clear lessons we learned from the conference were that local people must be listened to and their solutions must feed into the policy debate. And we still have most of, as it's been the countdown now, of less than 1,000 days, but close to that still, before we actually have the new post-2015 goals in place. So there is time for that template type of learning process and grassroots approach to getting the voice of those who are most affected by the changes that are taking place in developing countries. We need to more effectively link policy development process to reality on the ground. We need to invest, and this is the word, this is what was coming from the people on the ground who are at the cutting edge of the changes. We need to invest more effectively in knowledge, education and science, modern technology. We need dramatically to take action to empower poor households and especially women who make up 80% of the smallholder farmers in sub-Saharan Africa to engage in decision making. And of course there's a huge political issue here that has to be addressed and which to the present time is scarcely being touched. There are key messages which Ireland will now take to the policy discussions. These are key messages which Ireland will take to the policy discussions on a successor framework to the MDGs. And we are also conscious, very conscious indeed, that the post-2015 agenda, the same way as the Millennium Agenda in 2000, that it will require changes to our national approach to development, and that is, in many ways, it's not the starting point, but it is a central point in relation to our new policy development that we have put in place. So it is with this in mind that we recently conducted the extensive review of our development policy, which culminated in the publication of the new policy paper, Ireland's Policy for Global Development, One World, One Future. In the new policy, which I launched 2 weeks ago, we have set out 3 goals. Firstly, reduced hunger and stronger resilience. Secondly, and that of course ties up very much with our traditional legacy from the famine down, we are the country that spends greater percentage of our development aid, on hunger and nutrition than any other country in the world because of that legacy reasons we have brought it forward. So we're going to continue the emphasis there. Secondly, sustainable development, inclusive economic growth, and thirdly, better governance, human rights and accountability. So there are our three main goals. And then to achieve these goals, we have put together 6 priority issues for action. Global hunger, firstly, fragile states, secondly, climate change, thirdly, climate change and development, fourthly, trade and economic growth, fifthly, essential services, and sixthly, human rights and accountability. And most important of all is the emphasis we would be placing on the interconnections between all these priority areas for action. So while the MDGs we saw as being very straightforward, single-minded targets, we would be looking at the new MDGs as being, insofar as possible, being highly focused, straightforward, easy to visualise, but with a much greater complexity and interconnection underneath the immediate goals that will be set. So the new policy reaffirms our leading role on hunger. It affirms the need for more comprehensive responses to the impacts of climate change, and it places particular emphasis on responding to the needs of what we call fragile states. So in this context, it includes the announcement that another African state, Sierra Leone, has been designated a new key partner country for the government. And all our states what were previously our programme states will now be designated partner states because, first of all, it's a more appropriate and egalitarian designation, but also it allows us to participate at different levels. So, you know, whether or not it's humanitarian needs at one level, and then the partnership can rise to a different sustainable development and economic developments. So there's a continuum there that is better reflected in partners countries. This new approach recognises the importance of human rights in all that we do, and in particular the need to focus our efforts on better responses to gender equality and to disability, which again, disability, there will be a new focus on that. We will continue to work with our partners who have a proven ability to deliver quality programmes that deliver results for poor communities. So our partnership with the NGOs will continue as before, and we will continue to provide a partnership with and donor partnership with the different countries that we are engaged in. We will obviously continue to do what we have been doing in terms of overseas development aid, and we will be seeking to maintain that at the level that we have. We have maintained it and stabilised it, roughly 0.5%. There is a commitment in the programme for government to continue that up to 0.7%. That commitment will remain, and we will be addressing that in terms of discussions at the end of our presidency with the 27 member states and the incoming Croatia, the 28 member states. So can I say in conclusion that we are looking to bring all of that policy development then, which we have integrated into our presidency priorities. We're going to be bringing the presidency priorities when we have the conclusions at the end of the month, and they have to be getting a further imprimatur with that's the development presidency conclusions with the environmental presidency conclusions, because we are combined with the 3 commissioners with development, with humanitarian and with environment. So we have 3 commissioners on board, so we're bringing the presidency conclusions together and taking them then to the United Nations, where we will be presenting a common framework with priority issues at the United Nations Summit on the 13th of September as the position of the European Union. And we're hoping that all of that will be tied together by then. And then back at home, finally, we're dealing with this in a whole of government approach. We feel now that because of the nexus, the interconnections that are there, the accountability requirements, the governance requirements, the underlying human rights, this has all been accepted by the Cabinet as now not just a Department of Affairs policy, but that it is also very much a government policy with all of the departments buying into it. And that will be a major part of the way forward. So finally, I just want to thank you in conclusion for listening to me, rather too long. And I want to wish you the very best in your deliberations for the rest of the day. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Costello. You always take your time and always give us plenty of insight, and it's remarkable to see how integrated the thinking around development is within the Irish government, and I've no doubt that that's due to many of your colleagues in Irish Aid and to your own good efforts as well. So we're very grateful for that, and I look forward very much to seeing how things work out in terms of education, particularly as education begins to focus on the sciences and on the move towards the third level education. Now, I know that we've held on to you for far too long, and I know that your secretary is screaming down the phone at us, so we better let you go almost immediately, but thank you again for your input. So now we move to a different part of this morning's work, and that is the move to consider economics. This perhaps brings to light some of the more difficult and contentious issues facing the international development community today. For example, is the concept of Africa rising an optical illusion? Is it created by skewed statistics, or is it actually a reality? Is it simply a counterpoint to an historically dominant but equally inaccurate African narrative that concerns itself and has concerned itself for too long with only stories of famine and war and disease? Who is rising? Is it multinationals or the man on the street? And what is different? Has he more money in his pocket, more access to finance, or is he merely consuming more Asian manufactured products? And is that just being interpreted as a surrogate marker of development? What does the concept of Africa rising mean for aid, investment and infrastructure? What happens to aid after 2015 is not clear, with many governments moving in the direction of more trade and less aid. This approach is inevitable if the work of the past has had any value at all, but if it is interpreted too literally, could have very negative implications for areas such as health, hunger prevention, social justice, and the development of the biomedical sciences and education partnerships across Africa. The question we have to ask ourselves is the term Africa rising just an economic term, or are there political, social, and cultural connotations to it? And how is it linked to the rise of the media and smart technology? And how importantly, how much of this new narrative is being led by Africans for Africans? So we have asked two very highly informed speakers on these topics to come to us today to provide their perspectives. Quite different perspectives, I think, and I hope we'll be sparking quite a debate afterwards. Our first speaker is Mr. Wale Soyingbe, the Director of EMEA Trade in Citi Europe plc. Wale is based in Dublin and responsible for trade products and services to banks across Europe, Middle East and Africa. In his 22 years with Citi, he has worked in all areas of banking, including relationship management, personal banking, branch banking, commercial banking, product management, and so on. Prior to moving to Dublin, he was Global Transaction Services Head of the Commercial Banking Head for Citibank, Cameroon. He was and also worked with Expanded Market Business Manager for Africa. So he has 5 years in various brand management positions with Unilever and the West African Milk Company in Nigeria before joining Citi. He has travelled and worked extensively in Africa and still covers Africa in his current job. He holds an MBA from the University of Lagos, Nigeria, and a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University in Nigeria. Now, in discussion with Wale, and we had a very interesting discussion on the phone before he came over here, he is very clear that Africa is open for business. And I think he's going to give you his perspective on that. But he was also clear that for Africa to be open for business, it must be able to do so on its own terms and underpinned by ethical business practices and appropriate access to finance. His respondent, we shall turn to next, Mr. Vinay Nair, the Head of International Development, Acumen, UK. Vinay works in London for the Acumen Fund, which is a non-profit organisation that invests in companies providing critical goods and services to the poor in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. He's the former Executive Director at JP Morgan, London, and the Global Fund Technical Advisor to the Clinton Foundation. He received his BA in Economics and Political Science from Trinity College Dublin, and we're very proud to have him back here again today. and also a Masters of Public Administration from the London School of Economics. An outstanding academic pedigree, and mainly because there's Trinity in the title there. So there you go. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and academics are often accused of not living in the real world. Well, Vinay is very much an academic rooted in the idea that with profit comes responsibility, and the responsibility to make a real contribution to social impact and equity focus within business activities. So to start with, we'll have Wele, and then we'll have Vinay as a respondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hennessy. Honorable Minister in absentia, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor, and I'm very humbled to be called upon to talk on Africa to mark this Golden Jubilee and of the African Union, formerly known as the Organization of African Unity. 10 years ago, The Economist ran a cover with the title, Africa, the Hopeless Continent. Today, this has been replaced by Africa Rising, and this was in their December edition, which actually ties in well with today's theme, Africa Rising. This was a cover in the December edition of Economist. Now, this paper, or this talk today, is going to look at what engineered Africa's rise through difficult times, what's in store for it, its growth trajectory, other key driving forces, and the opportunities and challenges going forward, and lessons for Ireland. I'm not exactly sure I can cover such a huge continent in 20 minutes, but I'm going to give it a shot in 3 different parts. First, we'll talk about statistics about Africa to set the tone of what this great continent is all about today. Secondly, we'll look at the key engines of growth. What are the opportunities, the challenges, and the lessons? And then summary and call to action. I will say finally about 5 times during my speech. So if you start counting, by the time I say the 5th finally, that's when I'm about to leave. Right. Key statistics. Africa is a continent comprising of 54 member countries of the AU, but 55 recognized states, including Morocco. Africa has a population of 1 billion. And Africa is second largest and second most populous continent after Asia, and is growing faster than any other region in the world. Africa shows the largest percentage population growth than any other region in the world, and by 2150, Africa will have 20% of the world's population. Life expectancy varies by region. Today, it is about 49 years in Africa. In some other developed countries, it's about 76 years. But Africa will experience the largest increase in life expectancy from 49 years to 65 years. In Africa and Asia, 40% or less than 40% of the population is urban, with an urbanization pace of 4%. 49 African cities now have a population in excess of 1 million, and 5 of these, Cairo, Khartoum, Lagos, Luanda, and Johannesburg, are home to over 7 million people. With the exception of Luanda, all of these cities are larger than London. By 2030, the urban population of Africa and Asia will exceed 50%. So that tells us the magnitude of the growth potential. By approximately 1/3 of the population is in less developed countries is under age 15. This is a risk on one side, it's a double-edged sword. On the other side, it presents great opportunity. Total GDP has exceeded $1 trillion USD, with South Africa, Algeria, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco together contributing approximately 70% of this GDP. Africa accounts for about 3% of global trade, and it boasts of the richest natural resources compared to any other continent in the world. Some of these are oil and gas in Gabon, Ghana, Cameroon, Libya, Uganda, Cote d'Ivoire, Algeria, Nigeria, and Kenya. Metals and mining in South Africa, Gabon, DRC, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Zambia. Then you have commodities in Ghana, Gabon, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Cote d'Ivoire, Namibia, Mali, and Nigeria. Africa has 10% of the world's oil reserves, 22% of its gold, and 90% of phosphates. In the middle of the 2009 global economic recession, Africa was the only region, apart from Asia, that grew positively at about 2%. The continent's growth has been on an upward trajectory ever since then. 4.5% in 2010, 5% in 2011, 5.3% in 2012, and projected at between 5 to 7% on the average between 2013 to 2015. Africa has been the fastest growing mobile market for the last 5 years. Mobile phone penetration in Africa has risen from 4.75% in 2003 to 30.6% in 2008. It's 57% in 2012 and expected to reach 75% in 2015. With an estimated 500 million mobile telephone connections, service revenue hit 48.8 billion in 2012. That's an amazing number. It's expected to rise to 60 billion in excess, actually, in 2015. Liberalization of the telecom sector. In many countries like Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Uganda, and Tanzania has opened up new windows. More than 1 in 5 Fortune 500 global companies now operate in Africa. Those are key statistics about Africa. Let's look about the key engines of growth over the last decade. There's been much talk about growth in Africa in the last decade, but then mostly we've all talked about the commodity prices. And in some cases, they've actually attributed the growth to only the rising prices of commodity, particularly the crude oil. But then there's a lot more to rising prices in terms of the commodity development or commodity in Africa. If we have to understand the link between the commodity story and growth, it's not that easy. But generally, the key to pushing up GDP growth is growth in commodity production, not actually in commodity prices. Instead, higher commodity prices generally feed into growth indirectly, either by increasing government revenue or, crucially, in some cases, by increasing export earnings. These broad trends are clear for Africa's oil exporting countries, where the aggregate GDP growth rate has been pushed up sharply by exceptionally strong growth in a limited number of countries on the back of sharp increases in production, led by Angola and Equatorial Guinea. So most of the growth didn't come mainly from the rising prices of commodity, but actually in increased production in itself. In addition to oil, several African countries have vast deposits of mineral resources that have been left largely unexploited because of a lack of technical know-how. If we look at the oil story, we look at Tullow Oil, the Irish company, and we can see the kind of development that has happened within Tullow Oil in the last 5 to 10 years. Tullow Oil is a leading independent oil and gas exploration and production group, quoted both on the London, Irish, and Ghana Stock Exchange, and it's a constituent of the FTSE 100 index. The group has interest in over 80 exploration and production licenses across 22 countries and focuses on 4 core areas: Africa, Europe, South Asia, and South America. If you look at Tullow, 10 years ago, let's say in 2000, in the London Stock Exchange, their stock price was just at 62 pence. Today, Tullow, actually the last time I checked it, is going for £13.55. And if you look at the growth, was between the period when they discovered oil in Ghana, which of course Tullow spearheaded, and at the present when they started producing in Ghana. So we can look at the success story of Tullow Oil and its investment in Ghana, not in terms of not going into Ghana with a briefcase, going actually with proper investment, partnering with the government, partnering with local investors, and making money in the process at the same time. Let's look at the second point after the commodity story. We look at the peace dividend. That is fair stability politically across Africa. It's a double-edged sword also. It has been an engine of growth in the last couple of years. At the same time, too, it is a big challenge also going forward. But one of the best ways to highlight the extent of political diversity in Africa is to take a short trip around the West African coastline, from Senegal to Gabon. And we'll see that recently, through political crisis, though they went through some political crises, they're now rebuilding themselves, such as Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone. Then there are countries with long-standing autocratic regimes. And finally, there are some countries, such as Cameroon, Gabon, and Nigeria, that are probably best viewed as political hybrids, with aspects of democracy which is or can be known as homegrown democracy. And this is working, and that's the beauty about African politics. In Nigeria, we call it different things. Sometimes it's the bandwagon effect. We call it the domino effect. In some other countries, it's called the incumbency factor. But instead, what seems to have emerged over time are a range of political systems which have shown the capacity to evolve and, crucially, to survive crisis, rather than to slip back into conflict and chaos. So in terms of the homegrown political development in Africa, we have been able to establish a stable political environment that has contributed to the growth. Let's look at trade, not aid. Africans appreciate aid over the years. And honestly, without some of the aid, Africa wouldn't be where it is today. So that's well appreciated. But then, that's in the past. Now, let's talk about trade, no longer aid. And the main driving force of growth is trade. And that's why that's the next step. Now, this was risen in terms of value since 2005. It is potentially more interesting that the new wave of investment was not just into commodity projects, but has also been into other sectors, notably the consumer goods. The rise of technology in Africa. I remember when I was in university in the late 70s, when we needed to make a call to my parents, it's about 2 hours drive from where I was schooling, we need to queue for about an hour to use the only available phone to make it to call home. Today, the area of growth in technology trend in terms of mobile phone penetration has indicated that there is a large untapped consumer market on the continent. And arguably, nowhere else currently in the world where mobile revolution has been more high profile than in Africa. And I'll just give you a few examples. The number of mobile connections in Africa exceeded 500 million mark in 2012. Last year, the East African countries came on board in the fiber uptake. And they will not only help to deepen the internet and telecoms market, but they also allow businesses to operate more. Another important part of the mobile revolution in Africa was the role in financial inclusion. And this is really practical. If we look at Kenya today, the M-Pesa, you have 14 million people are estimated to deposit money through their phone to either save for future use or to send to other parts of the country. So we actually have a grassroots development and impact of the mobile technology in Africa. However, this mobile revolution will ultimately pay out in Africa remains far from clear. Vodafone released its numbers just 2 days ago on Wednesday, and they had negative growth in Ireland, in Italy, in Spain, and in almost all other Western Europe countries. Only Germany recorded a growth in the numbers that they showed, and it was just 0.5%. But then if you look at their two main markets in Africa, in Ghana, they had 22% growth. And this more than compensated for the growth, for the decline that they had in Western Europe. In Egypt, they had 3.7% growth in their latest numbers. So it's only the African countries that have actually recorded significant growth, even for Vodafone. So let's move on from that to the airline industry. The airline industry over the years, and I can remember also when I was growing up, I had a big aunt then who was studying in the UK. When we send letters, it takes 2 weeks to get to her. But then this has all been shortened right now. You have most of the international airlines. But going beyond that, you now have Africans that have actually developed also into setting up airlines within Africa. And if we look at the governments, take a look at the Kenya Airways, the Ethiopian Airlines, the South African Airways. These are key players in the market today, and they have been able to move people around Africa. The rise of BRICS in Africa. We cannot talk about the development in Africa today without talking about BRICS. But then I'll just concentrate on the Chinese and the Indians. While, as I've argued, South African companies are, of course, earlier investors in Africa. One of the most interesting economic stories in Africa over the last decade has been the rise of China. Two main factors. The pull factors, such as the rising growth in Africa. Two is the introduction of China's going out policy, where the government has encouraged investors to also go out, invest in other parts of the world. It's not only in Africa, but they are actually making their footprints in Africa at the moment. The most obvious change, of course, rather than being a sole player in large projects, Chinese companies are increasingly buying into companies that operate in Africa. The most high-profile example is with the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, that they bought 20% stake in Standard Bank of South Africa today. That was in late 2007. But the more active current deals are probably in the resource sector, and it takes two forms. Chinese companies are increasingly becoming junior partners in joint ventures, such as becoming a member of the Tullow Consortium developing the Lake Albert oil find in Uganda. Second, they are buying into small resource companies, such as Kalahari Minerals or independent oil companies. You also have India. India today plans to double trade turnover with Africa to 40 billion, focusing on investment in gas and oil sectors. And recently, they actually signed a bilateral trade agreement between Ghana and India, and they have set up a urea production farm. Now, Africa, in terms of agriculture, has large arable land. And Africa imports today over 3 billion worth of urea from all over the world. So nice move between India and Ghana. Set up this farm. There's no point importing urea again into Africa. And of course, this will create employment, and the multiplier effect of this will be felt across the economy. Infrastructure. Another area for opportunity, of course, is infrastructure in Africa. And this is one continent in which decades of underinvestment and mismanagement, and we're not going to be so naive to say that our infrastructural development has actually reached any appreciable stage. It is developing, but then there's still help needed. To highlight the depth of the problem, Nigeria, with a population of 180 million, has the same electricity capacity as Hungary, which has a population of 10 million. There are more people in Africa with access to mobile phones than those with access to electricity. And there is a substantial amount of investment that is needed. The World Bank report about 2 years ago says Africa needs approximately 100 billion every year to be able to develop its infrastructure. And we look at renewable energy. We have a lot of companies in Ireland that eat into renewable energy. Two companies I'm aware of are right now making waves in Nigeria, in the capital, Abuja, and also in Lagos. And they are developing even estates that are renewable energy sustainable right now at the moment. And these are still opportunities that we develop. And the moment you can develop energy for Africa, then it affects every sphere of life. It affects both the hairdressing salons, it affects the local organizers, it affects the barbing salons, and where you can always provide electricity. At the moment, it is a very difficult situation where each of these small businesses have to invest in generating sets, and it doesn't make their business very profitable. Let's look at the rise of African investors within Africa. And we've had a couple of Africans that have actually been investing in Africa themselves, and the growth in terms of their various, in the various sectors have been very noticeable. Beauty, we look at the South African companies. The Beauty company has extended into neighboring countries. We look at East Africa. You have the key Kenya supermarket. In West Africa, you have the Pay and Pick and Pay. You have the Goodies. You have ShopRite that has now expanded into Ghana, into Sierra Leone, and also into Senegal. You have the banks. You have Nigerian banks today. If we have about 4 banks having branches across Africa, total subs or networks in Africa is in excess of almost about 40 branches that have been opened in the last 40 years. So this creates employment, this creates some financial management within the various the countries where they have opened. The hotel industry, you have the Protea, you have the Serena in Kenya, and their natural expansion is within the neighboring countries. You have Serena now within East Africa. You have Protea that has expanded into West Africa. You have Sound & Son also that has expanded into West Africa. Even Radisson Blue. Radisson Blue is now everywhere almost in in Africa at the moment. And they have 252 Radisson Blue hotels across Africa. at the moment. And the most recent one is the one that was opened in Nigeria recently. Tourism is a key point where several African countries like Kenya, Mauritius, Seychelles, and Tanzania have become some of the world's favorite tourism destinations for obvious reasons. According to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, tourist arrivals into Africa in the year 2010 exceeded 49 million, and this is likely to pass 50 million mark in 2012. Now, we even have the billionaire Richard Branson. He'll be opening his luxury safari lodge in Masai Mara, Kenya, sometime next year. You have the Italian tycoon, Flavia Briatore, already owns Leone in the Sun, a luxury retreat also in Kenya. But then apart from the luxury lodges and retreats, several other opportunities are available in Africa's tourism sector. You have the Lake Victoria in Uganda that is still not as developed as the way it should really be developed. Africa's growth in tourism exceeded that of the most popular tourism destinations in Europe and America. And the World Tourism Organization, the tourism organization, 2020 vision forecasts that tourism movement to Africa will increase to almost about 70 million in the next 5 years. But look at Angola. It's a typical destination for most tourists today. Before, the only cheap thing in Angola was the AK-47, which was being sold for 19 euros or $19. But today, the war is over. And if you have to go into Angola today, a one-bedroom apartment in the city center costs you £7,500 a month to rent, and a pizza costs you £16 just for a 7-inch pizza. But then you still have tourists flocking in there. Finally, let's look at agriculture. Agriculture today, Africa's arable land makes up 40% of arable land globally. But unfortunately, Africa still can't feed itself. This is one area of opportunity also for Ireland. With our vast experience in agriculture in Ireland, this allows us to be able to really invest in that. We appreciate the aid, but then investment in agriculture will even allow Africans to really feed themselves. Despite all these engines of growth and opportunities, Africans are not naive not to know their shortcomings and challenges. We have trade policies, tariffs, and non-tariff barriers, non-convertibility of currencies. You have the political instability, improved investor protection. But then let me just quickly touch on one or two of these, of one of these challenges. Africa is not a country, but 55 countries. So this translates into 56 different regulations, governments, and languages. 2,000 languages are spoken on the continent. Potential investors will therefore need to navigate through a very complex business environment. Secondly, corruption, which comes a very close second to infrastructure problems. This is still growing in Africa. Africa is working hard on the political will to address corruption. But while the outside world has always been quick to pin the corruption label on Africa, I have always argued that it takes two to make this deadly tango dance work. Lastly, legal and regulatory, there's been so many improvements in the legal and regulatory framework, and I'll just give you examples. Mali, the time to enforce judgment has gone down from 515 days to 30 days. And this is a research and work which is being done by the organization called Investment Climate Facility for Africa, which is a public-private partnership forum, which is set up to deliver a better investment climate. And another example is Senegal. Increase in 1 billion customs revenue after the computerization. In Liberia, to register a business that reduced from 99 days to a maximum of 6 days. So definitely most of the countries are actually putting in efforts, and they're putting in resources to make the investment climate a lot more attractive, even for foreign investors. Political instability. Despite the media infiltration with Africa's failed states, democracy is clearly defining Africa's future. 10 years ago, there were 11 democratically retired African heads of states. Today, there are 34 of them that are retired and were more happy to go off. So coup d'etats are no longer an acceptable pathway to office in Africa. Africa's leaders are now running for office, and as important, leaving office. Summary. Political and economic stability has increased in Africa. Medium-term growth potential is about 6% per annum in the years ahead. Prevailing conditions call for an increase mainly in the commodity processing industry and the processing of agricultural products, which should be of interest to Ireland. In larger cities, a new middle class is creating demand for high-quality products Investments driven by urbanization is growing much faster across the continent. There is an emerging consensus that this could well be the African century. This is based on more than inspired hope and lofty rhetorics. It reflects the reality on ground. While the rest of the world continues to be mired in recession, the majority of African countries are raking up positive rates of growth. The Irish Exporters Association have recently set up a steering committee to draw up a strategy for Africa, and I'm happy to hear about the minister in terms of the 6 priority areas: trade and economic growth, also to be extended towards Africa. Potentially over 200 already registered for the Africa Forum, which is coming up sometime in October this year. But then I've attended seminars, I've attended different meetings where they have all identified Africa opportunities. Now is the time to walk the talk. Africa, the new frontier. Ireland must not miss the train. Thank you very much.
I think I'm absolutely certain that we're going to have loads of questions here and lots of things we want to ask you about. So I'm going to move directly to your respondent, Vinay, and then we'll sit you both down and we'll have a chance to have a chat before we have coffee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hennessy. Your Excellencies, distinguished professors and speakers, ladies and gentlemen. As Professor Hennessy said, I'm a Trinity grad, so it really is a proud moment for me to be standing on this side of the room rather than sitting where you are, having done that for some time. And I thought when you introduced Professor Hill, the line I would have said to him if he were here, and I might email him, is that I both started my degree and ended my degree here. So very proud to be here indeed. So thank you very much, TIDI, for inviting me along. As Professor Hennessy said, my role really is to act as a respondent. So if Wale thought he had it hard to capture the points in 20 minutes, I'm only given 10. But I shall give it a go. And really, I want to build on the opening idea that was put, that these sort of 2 classic narratives that we had are too simplistic, and how we actually can go about deepening and enriching our understanding and approach. And as a respondent, I think my role is to be a little bit provocative as well. And we had, fantastic examples of successes that we heard from the minister, and examples that we're seeing across the private sector and in trade. But I think it's also important to note that we have seen aid, in many cases, whilst having channels of successes, definitely creating a sense of dependence and charity. And frankly, the market's often bypassing the poor as well. And I think that the danger can be that sometimes when we have the narrative of aid has failed, which has many sort of substantive and agreeable points, that we can hurtle too far to the other side and say, well, a market-based approach is going to work, when I think we can all agree that the reality is not the case. And I just want to frame a little bit of what Acumen does as my way of responding to that, of really understanding, is there a way we can reconcile those two? If you think of the private sector really trying to maximize a financial return, and I think having been a former investment banker, I feel I'm allowed to sort of say we certainly did not succeed in maximizing a financial return. And actually having also worked in the charity sector, seeing that, when you traditionally expect charity to maximize social impact, the reality is that it can be often very conservative and very risk averse and not maximizing the social impact either, and important not to romanticize either perspective. And is there a way, therefore, we can inculcate dignity and choice into the way we work? Is there a way we can use investing as the means of tackling poverty and not think of investment just as the ends unto itself? And the organization I work for, Acumen, has been going for about 12 years, really working on trying to reconcile these two aspects, to think of, is there a way we can invest in companies that provide critical goods and services for the poor, that can introduce dignity, choice, and really think of the poor not as passive recipients of aid or charity, but active participants who can engage in their own destinies and really think of how we can enhance their capabilities. So we're not just thinking about job creation or microfinance, but really thinking critical goods and services. Acumen invests in 6 portfolios. Health is our biggest, which we heard some fantastic points about earlier. Energy, agriculture, housing, water sanitation, and education and employability as well. We are ourselves a non-profit, a charity that raises philanthropy, but then thinks of that philanthropy as the ultimate form of risk-taking capital, and invests equity and debt into companies that are providing these critical services. We operate across East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, and have just made our first approval for an investment in Ethiopia and in Ghana and Nigeria as well. And we also work in South Asia and starting in Latin America as well. And really, I want to use 3 examples of companies that we've invested in as a way of how we try and approach this idea of really thinking about dignity at the core of what we do. Because if we look around where we see both market failure and public good provision failure, oftentimes the enterprise-based, or indeed we think social enterprise-based approach is really what's making the impossible possible. How do you actually operate in that paradigm of seeing both markets and the public sector fail? And 3 of our companies that I wanted to touch on, the first, and very much linked to what Wale was discussing in agriculture, in healthcare, and actually in water and sanitation as well. If you look at M-Pesa, actually, let me start with that point. It's quite, such a fabulous success story. But I think what also I would add to how Wale described it and talk about Vodafone and Vodacom is that the initial risk-taking capital came from a DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK's challenge fund, that allowed Vodafone to take risk to explore if this was something that could work. And the idea of aligning different types of capital and different types of need to successfully create sustainable businesses for doing this can really give us the template of how collaboration can look like. We invested in a company in Ghana called GADCO, and we heard some remarkable statistics and interesting developments now with India and Ghana that you talked about, Wale. And if you look at rice in Ghana, 70% of rice is imported into Ghana. We invested in this company, interestingly set up by a Nigerian entrepreneur and a British-Indian entrepreneur, starting in Ghana, to see if they could create a rice farm and actually retain it for domestic consumption as well. And the idea wasn't just, let's get the best technology and create a rice farm, and I think this is the critical point. How could GADCO also work with thousands of smallholder farmers to help them have the technology transfer to improve their production? And so GADCO's model is to have a nucleus farm where they use the latest Brazilian, interestingly, technology, speaking of bricks, in the nucleus farm, share that technology with a group of smallholder farmers around the periphery. And the quid pro quo is, once you see both the increased productive yields from the smallholder farmer, GADCO aggregates that under one brand called COPA, gives them much more power in the market, and has an outtake agreement, actually 100% outtake agreement, because the quality of these rice tests that happen, that people can't believe actually this is rice made in Ghana for Ghana. 100% outtake agreement, so that the higher price that gets achieved, if you think of how market, sort of these value and supply chains work, can then also be passed through to the smallholder farmer. So it's using both commercial aspect, but actually trying to maximize the social impact, the number of smallholders that can be worked with as well. But needing to recognize that it's not just about giving, agri inputs or extension services, and even with the best will in the world, hoping that maybe production can improve, but actually thinking from an enterprise-based approach as well. I want to touch on an example. So Acumen has invested, we've been working for about 12 years now. We've invested in 72 companies, about $83 million, about $1 million per investment. And I wanted to take you up on the technology side as well. We invested in a company called Sproxil, actually, a quite brilliant entrepreneur, actually also Ghanaian, who developed this technology to tackle counterfeit drugs across sub-Saharan Africa. And he started in Nigeria, where the WHO says over 70% of drugs are actually counterfeit, and something I spoke to Professor Hill about earlier as well. And the idea is, can you actually have a strip? What they've developed is to have a strip on the back of these of medicines where you scratch it off, send in an SMS, and find out if the drug is real or counterfeit. And so again, understanding that the poor will always be the ones who end up suffering the most and have this double whammy, which Professor Hill was talking about as well, of not just that they're expending this money on getting drugs, but then to have the double whammy that it's a placebo or a non-working drug, to actually see if you can find ways to actually support them as well. And now we've seen Sproxil, 3 million SMSs have been sent, text messages have been sent. And you can see, and now they're expanding into other parts of Western Africa, and will expand into Pakistan and India next as well. Finally, I wanted to pick on one of our examples in East Africa, and it's our latest investment, so I thought it'd be interesting to share. A company called Sanergy, three brilliant, quite young entrepreneurs, Stanford graduates, who've really trying to figure out, again, if for those of us who have spent time around the developing world, open defecation is something that's just very hard to figure out. And we've seen continued but failed attempts on slum toilets and ways to work, typically because you see the sort of non-maintenance and this sort of downward trajectory that happens. Now, could an enterprise-based approach work? Maybe the answer is yes, maybe the answer is no. But ultimately, from our perspective, this philanthropy that we raise, we invest as what we call patient capital. So the ability to stay with a company and provide the post-investment management support for 10 plus years if required to iterate, to do the R&D to see if it works. And Sanergy's innovation is to not just have the slum toilets, which they have these micro-entrepreneurs who go out and set them up, but actually also collect on a daily basis the hard waste, they separate out the waste, and create a second revenue stream by converting that into organic fertilizer. So again, we're seeing the entrepreneur, the social entrepreneur who's really innovating and figuring this out. Now, will this succeed? I mean, we don't know. The point is that we have to use our capital to take risk. We have to accept and embrace that there will be failures. But when you see these successes working, that the social impact is outsized, and that's what motivates us to do what we do. Acumen has 3 pillars that we work on. We invest in social enterprises, emerging leaders, and breakthrough ideas. And I just want to finish my response on the last 2 as well. The emerging ideas, just to touch on briefly, because I'm in these hallowed walls, how can I not? Really this idea of what are we learning? What does impact actually mean? What does it look like? How can we understand it? How can we create better feedback loops so that the companies can understand it, so it's not kind of an onerous M&E type of process, but actually valuable for them on their ongoing standard operating procedures? And then to disseminate that information around. And it's something that Acumen has been doing for quite a bit of time now in this pioneering work set up by Jacqueline Novogratz 12 years ago. But the last point is on emerging leaders. And I'll wrap with this point as well. I think we need to recognize that whilst there's tremendous potential, not just in Africa, but globally, a new type of leadership is going to be required. And Acumen, about 6 years ago, launched a global fellowship program where we take people from around the world and give them training in 3 aspects: financial skills, operational skills, and what we call moral imagination, which we say is the humility to see the world as it is, but the audacity to envisage how it could be, and understand how to operationalize that when you're sitting in a slum in Kibera or sitting in northern Ghana, and actually working out what that means and how you bring those 3 things together. We get 1,000 applications for these 10 places from amazing global citizens. But what we realized 3 years ago is we also need to enhance leadership in the countries in which we work as well. And with the support of Kenya Commercial Bank and the Rothschild Foundation, we launched an East Africa Fellows Program. 20 places, almost an executive version of this curriculum that we've developed. We had 560 applications from all our countries in East Africa. We had, the dream. I mean, it was literally the dream. We had a PPE graduate from Oxford, and we had a lady who'd not really left her slum in Kibera, actually, on the same cohort, leading social change projects. And now we're on to the 2nd and 3rd cohort, and we're expanding that to the rest of the countries we work in. And I want to end on that point that I feel like leadership is really what a lot of this comes down to. As an investor, you always know it's the entrepreneur, the person. From an academic perspective, we always need to understand, have that intellectual rigor of those people who are working. And I think when it comes to these new paradigms, when we talk about Africa Rising, there's tremendous potential and need to invest in leadership as well, to really be the change that we want to see. So with that, I'll conclude and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Well, the job of TIDI can be very easy when we get fantastic speakers, as we just have had. So I think it is a really great thing when we put two speakers together, one who speaks so well to the hard and fast of growth, and the other who speaks so well to moral imagination and social responsibility. And it makes for a very interesting pair. I've no doubt that you have plenty of questions. So Sarah is going to go around there with a roving microphone, and if you just announce yourself, and we'll try and get through a few.
Should I get up?
Stand up, English, yeah.
Hello, my name is Hafsa. I'm working in the Africa Centre in Dublin. I have a question for the representative of Acumen organization. I would like to know if you had to face corruption anyhow when you come with an investment proposal, because we hear a lot about corruption in Africa, so I just wanted to know if it was factual. Thank you.
Okay.
That's a great question, and it very much is the case. And I think again, it's about there are two things I think really here. We can't shirk from the realities that corruption exists and does happen. And I think that's the first point, is to acknowledge it, not overstate it though, but to acknowledge it. Our approach really is, rather than, because we're an investor, you get very real-time information on what's happening. And I think that is the way we try and reconcile the sort of risks of corruption, especially around, distribution of bed nets, and, you don't really have valid data that happens. But actually, we invested in a solar lantern company called D-Light that operates in 47 countries now. And the reality is that you can see through the sales numbers and a lot of the more conventional market-based metrics, what the realities around corruption are. With the EU and US, we're a US nonprofit. That's where we're primarily or initially incorporated, and they have very strict anti-corruption laws that rolls through to the investor at Acumen. So we have very strong and very rigorous zero corruption rules, kind of because we need to, and kind of because we need to protect ourselves, from a legal perspective as well. And even in one case, we've exited a company where we found corruption at a high level. So, there have been two different interesting experiences. I'll just quickly wrap on this. One where we found that one of the agents that was working for the company was being corrupt and trying to bribe a sort of almost a regional level official. And so we worked closely with the entrepreneur to figure out how best to kind of cut that out. And it turned out to be, the conclusion was to sack that employee and actually to work with, to investigate if there was more widespread corruption, and to, actually we kind of almost redoubled our efforts with the company to kind of weed it out. In the second case, we found it at a pretty high level at the company. Because of the nature of what we do, and again, as a non-profit investing fund, we need to do what's right, not what's easy. And so we had to take a financial loss on the exit that we did. Somebody else was prepared to step in. But we felt that was the right call and the right signal to send. And so it exists. I don't think we should overstate it, but I think we need to be honest and clear in how we tackle it.
Okay. Other questions? I might ask one of Adewale. I mean, I think you gave a great picture of growth, but what do you see as being the essential elements of the balance between trade and aid, say for the next 10 years? How would you pitch that balance?
Thanks. I would pitch that more in the area of trade than aid. And while aid still has very important areas to cover in Africa, Africa is a large continent. You're talking about 1 billion people. So before trade actually gets to the major grassroots, it will take a while. So we're still looking at 40% urbanization in the whole of Africa. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at trade in itself, you're looking at 40% of the population. So you still have aid that would probably still come in very useful for the remaining 60%. Now, but the trade is expected to accelerate the growth rate, and of course help in terms of urbanization or help develop the rural areas. And one of the areas which I mentioned earlier on is agriculture. Most of the 60% living in the rural areas are actually the ones engaged in agriculture, feeding those of the 40% in the urban centers. And investments in agriculture will, of course, assist those in the rural areas to be in terms of either increase their spending power and be able to allow them grow more crops, storage, and that in turn will continue maybe from the aid system, and over the next couple of years, you'll probably see that move more even into trade. So it will continue. Aid will continue to play a major role, definitely. But for now, for us to be able to really urbanize, for us to get into the Committee of Nations, I think trade should take the front burner.
Okay. Questions, Carol? And I saw another hand at the back. Maybe we'll take 2 questions and then a couple of answers.
I'm Carol Newman from Department of Economics here in Trinity College, and my question is primarily for Wele, but also maybe Vinny would like to comment. So this model of trade and investment as a path to growth and development, I think, is very desirable for Africa and allow it to release its potential. But in the absence of every enterprise being a social enterprise, there is a challenge in terms of making sure that this investment is ethical and it's socially responsible. So how and what model do we use to make sure that the fruits of growth reach everybody, reach the poorest and most vulnerable? How do we make sure that business is done ethically? How do we make sure that foreign investors into Africa link in with the rest of the economy, link in with the local supply chains? And it's really only through that type of linkage that the real benefits of growth can be realised. The evidence suggests that so far, lots of this foreign investment, in fact, does not link in any way with local producers. And I mean, my question is, how do we address this issue?
That's one. Maybe we'll take the second question as well.
Conal Foley from Concern. Just a couple of, I thank you both very much for presentations. They're very stimulating. I think particularly Vinay, the acumen model is absolutely fascinating and is really quite stimulating. I suppose a couple of questions which link in with the last questioner. I'm interested in, I suppose in microfinance we've seen, I suppose, this idea of the double bottom line where you're talking about financial profitability and sustainability and also social impact. I'm interested to know if either of you have come across models where you have companies, private sector, that have some kind of metrics around social impact. I mean, I think, the corporate social responsibility is often very much box ticking, often a bit of PR. So I'm interested in ones that have maybe metrics and governance around social impact. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, from your question. Last year we had a meeting with the minister, Costello, that is, went with the Irish Exporters Association, and to look at how we can actually support the Irish exporters, either trying to invest in Africa or even trying to partnership or trying to export into Africa. One of the suggestions then was, say, today, if you look at the Irish embassies across Africa, not a single one has a trade desk. So if you see an investor in Ireland wanting to go into Ghana, I mean, he's probably just going there completely lost, at least from the beginning. He doesn't know, one, the local regulations. He doesn't know where to go in terms of the ministry. He probably doesn't know the key players in the economy there. And the suggestion was, say, let Ireland pick key markets. And let's see whether the provision or the establishment of trade desk, which is very key. If we look at most of the American embassies across the world, hardly will you see anyone without a trade desk there. So any American company wanting to go into a specific country, its first port of call is the embassy. As they say, I need the complete lowdown as to what happens to this country. This is the area I'm going into. And because the embassy is more or less like localized, they know the environment very well, and they can always assist the investors. See, there are some countries, and I keep saying this, if you try to go through the back door, you hurt yourself badly. But then if you're going through the straight and narrow way, it might be expensive. It might take so long. But then you'll have a lot of people who would come, oh no, we can get you this business registration in 10 days. When in reality, you know that it's going to take 30 days. Oh, but then with a little bit of extra money, you can get this. Now, it's either you get a wrong business registration, okay, either a fake one, or the person probably takes the money and then disappears. But then with the establishment of a trade desk, it does go a long way to help any investor going into the country. That was one major area, and I would say that it would help tremendously. And we look at, and I happened to be, when I was in Cameroon, we were sharing the same building with the American embassy. And the trade desk was manned by a very energetic and very forward-looking gentleman. And he spent 3 years. And within those 3 years, if I remember correctly, the number of investors that was brought into Cameroon, I really can't remember exactly the number now, but you're looking at almost an average of 5 every year, and coming in through the embassy. So it's one area that really I would always recommend. I mean, for investors or for anybody wanting to go into a particular country.
Thank you. If I may, I'll touch on Carol's question at the start and link it to how you framed the CSR piece, as well as sort of a bit of PR and a bit of sort of box ticking. I think broadly I would agree with that, but I think what's interesting now, and I think the answer is that it's such a big question, and I think it won't be a narrow answer or narrow solution. Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever, is on Acumen's advisory board. And for me, the answer comes back to leadership. So Unilever sell 2 billion products a day, right? And so he said, how do we double that? And how do we look at Africa and Asia as our key growth markets? He said, you know what, to do that, I'm going to scrap quarterly reporting. And some young hedge fund upstart was in one of the meetings and said, but what about this? And he said, that's the door, you can walk. I mean, this is the CEO of Unilever saying that. So I think we need to see authentically people not just doing a CSR for the sake of it with the pretty picture in their annual report, but authentically seeing ways in which inclusive business can actually work. It's that big an issue, but I think if we see the challenges that are happening everywhere, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but really globally, it's going to be more and more important. And I think we'll have, the CEO of Puma, even the CEO of Barclays, who, also on our advisory board, so full disclosure, said he's going to shut down his tax arbitrage desk internally. Loads of people up in arms, but I think that's amazing leadership again. So that's probably how I would think about it. It's this sort of sense of what inclusive business can look like from the large multinationals, not just these sort of smaller social enterprises. And then to link that to this question on the metrics for social impact, microfinance has a lot to teach us, both in its growth and sort of the challenges it saw in the last few years. I wrote a piece when I was on a sabbatical from my job at JP Morgan on the dangers of leverage in microfinance. I think it got a bit too frothy and was positioned a bit too much as a silver bullet to tackle poverty, which I think it has such an important role to play, but maybe got oversold a little bit, and there was a little bit too much focus on the financial return than the social impact. And what I think the opportunity and the need is really to find relevant social outputs for the companies, because otherwise things can be so burdensome and you're managing to your funder rather than managing for your customer, the person you're existing to serve. And I think that has to be where the starting point is. Acumen, we got a $5 million grant from Google about 6 years ago to develop an online social metric system called Pulse. And in the spirit of our founder, Jacqueline, she said, actually, that's brilliant. Let's make it open source and give it to everyone. And now 40 funds use that. And we're rolling it into industry standard called IRIS, International Reporting and Impact Standards. And so there are some real ways that we're moving to better harmonizing what the social outputs look like. And just finally working closely with academics, particularly on randomized trials in certain areas, and seeing where RCTs can give us the really richer impact data that answers the questions about what we're doing and the impact that it's having.
Very good. I think we can maybe have one more, if there's one more. Literally one more. Or I'm stopping you from having the cup of coffee that you badly need, I know that. But I think these are super speakers with a lot to say. And the words hanging in the air for me, or the authenticity of the metric. And I can see that, you know, there's a lot about that. Okay, lastly and briefly.
Hi, yeah, I'll be quick. Yeah, we've seen in the last week in Ireland that, I mean, our government is basically being held to ransom by multinational companies who aren't paying their corporation tax or are paying incredibly low levels here. So I'm just wondering, how do you think African countries can, you know, make massive corporations actually spend or pay their taxes in their own countries? You know, we're really struggling with it here, so I'm just wondering from what you think the power that the African countries actually have.
Where double taxation treaties do not exist, then that means you really have to pay taxes in both jurisdictions, wherever you operate in. Now, from the last, I think Ireland, for example, has only double taxation treaty with about 2 countries in Africa so far, or 4. Okay, yeah, just about 4 countries in Africa. So, of course, that could be a very good starting point. Because just the investor wants good returns on his investment and wouldn't want to pay off taxes in the 2 places. There's been so much noise, of course, recently about some various companies that have been paying tax, or where some governments have been saying, no, they haven't been paying tax. But then there's been very strong defense as to say they paid every single tax that they are supposed to pay. Now, I'm not going to hold brief for any organization here, but if you translate this to Africa, I think the good starting point will be the double taxation treaty, just to be fair on the investor also. And from there, I think we can take that forward. From 4 countries out of 54 countries or 55 countries in Africa, I think we could do probably a lot better than that. Yep.
Okay. Make a quick point just to add to that. Excellent point from Wele, is that another part of building these sustainable companies is actually moving from informal economies into the formal economy. And I think, and maybe, you know, one of the key social metrics is also around taxes paid. And so it's not just around, you know, holding the feet to the fire of the multinationals. And I think you got a better answer from Wele than I can offer. For me, it's also understanding authentically again, genuinely growing the SME sector and broadening your tax base as well. And I think that's another key part of seeing how we'll see engines of growth and inclusive growth and success.